Now, a lot of people would know in this room the anticipation and the excitement that comes from the anticipation of waiting for your first child to arrive. Who's been through that experience here? How many parents have we got? It's an amazing experience, isn't it? It's really hard to describe to other people that haven't been through it. But everyone will tell you how great it is or how hard it's going to be and all these things. And I've got a lot of friends who didn't even have kids and they still want to give you all the advice under the sun about how great it's going to be or how hard it's going to be. But people in this room, obviously, a lot of people in this room understand what it is to go through that. So my wife and I were going through these feelings as well, waiting for the birth of our first child. And one thing I've learned over this journey is that it's different for every single person. Now, when my little girl was born, it was the greatest day of my life, and I still remember holding her for the first time. And I was there with her, and I had her in my arms, and I was just looking at her and just thinking, she's the most beautiful thing in the world. And I promised her at the time that I would do everything in my power to look after her forever. And it was one of those moments that as a dad, you just do not forget. And everything was going beautifully at that moment. Everything was easy. And for 3 days it went along like that. All the friends and family came to visit us and you had to go through the whole joy and elation of this first baby. But then on day 3, our little girl had her first seizure. And it was one of those experiences that you go through when your heart just drops because it's not something you've got in your game plan as to what's going to happen with this journey. And we didn't know what to do. And this sense of elation had just turned into an absolute sense of panic. Now, the thing is, a lot of people have seizures, so a lot of children do and a lot of adults do. But the thing is, with a 3-day-old baby, when a seizure takes over their body, they don't have the strength to continue to breathe. So when the seizure hits, they stop breathing and they start going bluer and bluer and bluer. And when the seizure happened for the first time and the medical staff looked at her, they knew that obviously something was pretty traumatically wrong and they needed to get her to the Royal Children's Hospital in Brisbane. So she got airlifted out. And this is my little girl here, only a couple of days old. And we got airlifted to the Brisbane Hospital, and they gave her actually a loading dose to transport of a drug called phenobarbital. Now, if anyone's heard of phenobarbital, and you look it up on Google, one of the first things you'll find is actually the drugs that vet use to put dogs down. And so when you think about your little girl getting injected with this drug, it makes you obviously change your perspective on anything in life. So we went down to the hospital and we spent 3 days at the Royal Children's Hospital down there, and she didn't have another seizure and everything was going well, so they sent us home. So we go home, just put that experience behind us. It's a one-off, forget about it. And we were home one day, and the next morning my wife was feeding my little girl and she had another seizure in her arms, and we had no medical staff around. And the seizure stopped, but she didn't start breathing again. And she just stayed there in my wife's arms, just going bluer and bluer and bluer. And this little lifeless body that my wife was holding was just looking back at her just with these little lifeless eyes. And I just thought at that moment, I need to do something. My little girl needs her dad. And so I grabbed her out of my wife's arms, and I remembered the promise that I'd made to her only 3 days before. Now, when I made that promise, I was thinking, look, I've got 15 or 20 years, or when she's allowed to date when she's 37, and I need to bash some guy who, is doing the wrong thing by. That's what I thought that promise meant. But 3 days later, here I am holding her on our lounge room floor, not breathing. And I just thought, I need to act. And I bent down and I picked her up in my arms and I started to give her mouth-to-mouth. Now, if you've ever given an adult mouth-to-mouth, it's still a hard thing, but your head's roughly the same size. But when you give mouth-to-mouth to a baby who's just coming on a week old, it's a different experience because obviously they've got such little faces and your mouth needs to cover their mouth and their nose to actually breathe into them. So I breathed into Lucia's mouth for the first time and nothing happened. She just stared at me going bluer. I breathed into her again and nothing happened. And then I breathed into her once more and then I looked down and she went and took a gasp. And I still remember that feeling in my heart when she took that gasp and she started breathing again and that beautiful little pink colour came back to her face that you can see there. But obviously that wasn't the end of our journey. We got airlifted back to the Royal Children's Hospital in Brisbane. And this was my little girl in hospital when we were going through that process, when they're putting electrodes on her brain to try and work out exactly what was going on. Now for us, and going through that experience, it was just something that, as I said, you never expect. And at the time, before we had Lucia, I'd owned a big business. We got 20 offices throughout the state. It was a $100 million turnover business. But to be honest, in those 31 days that my wife and I stayed in that hospital, how many times do you think I thought about that business? Not once. It just didn't enter my head. It just wasn't important anymore. And I was lucky because at the time, we're at a point where I could focus on my wife and my baby for that 31 days and go through that journey with them. And we were lucky. So after that 31 days and going through a lot more seizures and a lot more medication trials, we were able to take her home. And over the next 6 months, she became better and she became strong enough to be able to her body to basically work out how these seizures were happening, and it basically resolved itself. So 12 months later, this is my little girl. And she's a beautiful little thing, and you cannot see in this photo how cheeky she is, that's for sure, because she's a little brat at times, but I love her to death. She's just a fantastic little thing. And we were incredibly lucky because we're in a first world country with amazing medical facilities that were able to save her life at the time we were going through it. But in my business, when I got back into day-to-day life, we heard about children on the other side of the world that also needed some help. And we heard about the plight of 35 orphans that didn't have a house. And we had a building company. These kids needed a home, so I thought we can do something. So we come up with this fantastic presentation to be able to present to our franchisees. 20 minutes long, it was going to be fantastic, going to this big crescendo. We start the presentation to our group of builders, and we get 2 minutes in, and one of the guys just stops and he goes, "That's enough, I've heard enough. I'm in. Who else is in?" We got 2 minutes in, and every hand in that room went up and said, "I'm in, let's help these kids." So for the next 6 months, we raised $150,000. We bought a block of land in Cartelux, this little town in northwestern Kenya, and we planned to go and build this home for these kids. So this is one of the little orphans that were there when we arrived in Cartelux. And this was our first day on site when I looked at the face of these little children, and I saw the same eyes I saw in my little daughter, and I thought, this is just an amazing experience to be part of. So the builders got to meet all the kids that we were there to help over the course of that time. We were there for that 10 days. And our 10 days on site, what our goal was to put the roof on to be part of this experience. So we went through that experience and we helped on site, and we worked next to a lot of different Kenyan builders at the time. And when we were in this hole one day, I was helping dig this hole with these Kenyan workers, and I turned to the guys and I said, "Guys, what's it like working with the Australian builders?" And they go, "The Australian workers, they are like bees, like bumblebees, because they make lots of noise, but they work very hard." And I thought, well, that's a pretty good description of our group of guys that we took on site. Now, I showed this photo actually to a mate of mine, and he said to me, "Wow, you're building these kids a swimming pool." I went, "No, we're building them an orphanage. This is actually a septic pit." I said, "You can go back in 12 months' time and swim in it if you want to, but it won't be that pleasurable experience." So we went through the experience of meeting these kids and building on site, and over the course of that 10 days, we were able to get the roof on this building, which was fantastic. But one of the little girls that I met when we were there was a little girl by the name of Metron. Now, Metron was an AIDS orphan. She was 9 years old, and she'd been with the orphanage for a few years. And basically, when I met her, she just stole my heart. She was just this amazing little girl. And I remember going to site one day, and I thought, I'm going to grab a chocolate bar to take with me to site today, because I knew I was going to see Metron on site. So I got to site with my chocolate bar, and I got Metron. I said, Metron, come over here. And all the kids went inside the orphanage with all the other builders, and I broke off half, and I gave her half, and I scoffed my half, being the fat Aussie guy that was over there, and she just took her little piece, and she broke a little piece off and ate it, and put the rest of it in a pocket. And I thought, I wonder why she's doing that. And then we got inside, and she ran up to a little friend. And she grabbed this chocolate out of her pocket, and she gave it to a little friend. And honestly, it was 3/4 of what I'd given her. And she just sat there with this massive smile on her face, watching her friend enjoy this experience. And I just thought, how incredible is this? This little AIDS orphan on the other side of the world has never had anything. And the first thing that she thinks of when she gets something is to share it with someone else. How amazing would life be if we all looked at it like that, and we all had that experience? And one of the last things we got to do while we were there was to visit a UN refugee camp. And this UN refugee camp was about an hour from where we were building the orphanage. Now, we were helping 35 kids, but we turned up to this refugee camp, and there was 10,000 people in this refugee camp. 8,000 of them were kids. And we thought, how can you help them? In these tents that you can see, sometimes there was 14, 16 people living per tent, and this was it. This was all they had because their homes had been burnt down through the tribal violence that was happening in that area. And we thought there's just so much more to be done. But we thought, well, look, we can help those kids, and those 35 kids have now turned into 70 kids that are in that orphanage, which has been an amazing, fulfilling experience. And one thing I've certainly learned over time is that fulfillment doesn't come from chasing money or chasing your own personal goals. It's actually the complete opposite. It comes from those times when you're actually helping others and when you're involved in other people's lives. And I think if we can all do that, then we can all be catalysts for change. So thank you.